age that people start getting concerned about the fact that they forget things. Every now and then, as in at least once a day, I'm presented with something that I said or did or wrote, and I have no recollection of ever doing that. And it's a concern. It always is. My dad used to say, as long as I can spell Alzheimer's, I'm good. But I have this comforting recollection that my memory has been pathetic since forever. One test that someone once suggested was that if you're worrying about forgetting where you put your keys or parked your car, just remember how many times you forgot to take your lunch to school as a child. And that should give you a little bit of confidence, because I'm hoping most of you also forgot your lunch. But I remember a day in February when I was at theological college and responsible for the service that day in the chapel. And I used to write everything on yellow paper because white paper gave me migraines, and I would split the paper in half and write notes on 2 columns because it was faster. And so I was following my notes for what I was going to do in that service, and I turned the page and had completely forgotten that I was supposed to sing next by myself. I'd written that in and totally blanked. It was probably good, because if I'd remembered, I would have been far more nervous during the first part, and as it was, I was only sick to my stomach practically when I turned that page and realized that I was to sing. And I'm going to try to sing to you now what it was I was supposed to sing then. It's going to be bad. I just want you to know that. It's going to be bad. I also, Elaine, could you go flick off those 2 middle switches there? We had this very significant conversation about what we were going to do about the lighting when I got up, and I forgot to take care of it. Thank you very much. Here it is. I have no idea what note to start on either, but it went, "Free Nelson Mandela, I want to see him walking down the street in Soweto tomorrow." Do you remember that? Does anyone remember that? Sing it with me. "Free Nelson Mandela, I want to see him walking down the street in Soweto tomorrow." Not bad. Thank you very much for that accompaniment. As I was beginning to get ready for my service this week, the theme was radical generosity. But the death of Nelson Mandela inserted itself in that preparation in a way that I could not ignore. And so that song coming back into my head reminded me of those days and the challenge that lay before the world, the challenge that lay before us all, to find a way to make a situation better than it was, to look at what the realities were and find something that we could do to make a difference. The United Church before that had set sanctions, put boycotts of goods coming out of South Africa. Nobody bought wine, South African wine. There were all kinds of things that we would see the label in the grocery store and ignore it. The whole world participated in that action in many ways, so that that change would come about. So as I reflected on radical generosity prior to Mr. Mandela's passing, I was thinking about what that meant, and the first thing I do whenever I have a theme is Google it. And of course, when you Google radical generosity, the sites that come up are all sites that are evangelical Christian sites, that are talking about the generosity that is required of us because of the generosity of a God that is responsible for all the goodness in our lives. And because of all that goodness, we are then to give back to God, and of course, who best to represent God than the church? So the church can call that claim in, that for what you have received in your life, you can give back to the church, that it might make its message manifest in so many different ways around the world. But over the course of the last many years, we of course have looked at that equation and recognized that it is the goodness that comes to us, whether we believe it comes from a God or not. It comes to us more often than not through human hands, through the deeds that another human can do for us, for the words that are spoken on behalf of another person, one whose voice has been silenced or whose voice cannot be heard. That goodness that comes into the world is exclusively handled, touched, made, manufactured by human hands. And so I looked down through our stories to find those examples of radical generosity, the root of the word radical being root, the beginnings of, what starts something to begin with. What was the initial impetus of that? The radical generosity is getting back to the very beginnings of that story. And so in our tradition, when we get back to that story and we look at that radical generosity, we find the stories about that man named Jesus, those legends that have been told, that speak of him giving his life over to changing the world in which he lived. That's the liberal interpretation of those stories, the interpretation that is spoken when we talk about stewardship and generosity in the liberal church. We often pull out those stories of a radical kindness that was offered by that man, the stories that come down to us that we remember. And we can fast forward and think of other people like Gandhi, who lived his life in this way that brought him so close to the day-to-day that every single person who he was leading could see themselves in his actions, in his message, in his desire for freedom from what he considered to be an oppressive relationship with Britain. Everyone could see in that radical act of everyday weaving, spinning, making his own things, that they too could take back their own responsibilities for the world. And Martin Luther King Jr., how radical is that story that each individual is born filled with everything they need to bring about their own individuality, and that it is those around them and the culture and the politics and the state that must provide the room for that individuality to grow. A radical message, incredible generosity. The Stages of Faith by James Fowler talk about how our faith develops from our being very small until we come to understand and interpret the world in a way that incorporates the myths that we have been told, understands them, can use them to create meaning in our lives. Or not. We may choose not to use them at all and to find meaning in other ways. But the last two stages, the most highly developed stages, are the ones that I would say these men, these stories bring us to. The idea that we can finally, at some place, lose our own need to protect ourselves in order to be present to the needs of the world. We become bodhisattvas, sort of. We channel the world to a better place by giving up our own identity, our own needs, by giving up our own desire for self. And so, those who attain these highest levels, stage 6 in James Fowler, are people who give their lives over to others, so that others might flourish, so that they might find their way to a different path. I've always admired those stories. I've always thought that would be such a great place to be. Except that the people who got there were usually killed. But Nelson Mandela died. Nelson Mandela was not killed. Nelson Mandela might have lived in a time when peace and justice are more readily available than Martin Luther King Jr., that was just the 60s. Or Gandhi, come on. The time isn't all that different. So what is it that was different? What is it that made a difference? Why wasn't he taken out by a sniper? I think it's because of what Steve offered. The fact that when he became the leader in South Africa, when he became the one who had the power to make the decisions that would deal with his oppressors, those who had locked him away, who had made life horrible, a horror for individuals and for a whole people, that he chose grace and compassion and courage. And so he lived an example for all of us of generosity, of spirit, that pouring out of one's life into a place where we can be whole. The word that is often connected with Mandela is an ancient word, Ubuntu, which means I am a person because of the people. We only have an understanding of who we are because of the people who are around us, and we only survive because of those people around us. As one of the lines about it explains, you cannot pick up a grain of wheat with only one finger. We need another to help us do that. There's a story of an anthropologist who was studying people in Africa and who, when he was about to leave, decided that he would have a celebration with the children and filled a pail full of candies and treats and placed it under a tree and set up a race for the children, saying, we're going to have a celebration, I'm on my way, let's have a race. And the children lined up, and he said, okay, I'm going to say go, and whoever gets there can have all that candy to themselves. And he said go, and the children took one another's hands and ran to the bucket, sat down around it, and started sharing all the candy. And this anthropologist who had been studying there for ages only finally got it when one of the children said, to his question, why didn't you run fast? You could have got it all for yourself. He said, how could I be happy when the other people were not? Understanding Ubuntu was part of Mandela's life, woven into his heart. He understood that he could only be happy if everyone could be happy, and so he worked tirelessly to bring that about, allowing those who had oppressed him to take positions in his government, giving them the opportunity to speak, opening the entire country to a truth and reconciliation process that could only have been filled with incredibly horrible tales of suffering and loss and death and persecution, and yet called them through that so that as history unfolded day by day, they would be able to find a place of peace. It was a powerful and courageous act. But it's not his act, not just his. And it's not something that you can go from this place thinking that was a wonderful man. The act that that man lived was an act that we are all born to. It was an act that our stories call us to. We are not called by a divine being who has a plan in place for us. We are called by one another. We are called by our great-great-great-grandchildren. We are called by the world yet to be. We are called to live as this man lived, recognizing that no one can be happy unless everyone is happy. What happens to me is happening to you. I am not free until we are all free. And so, though I know each one of you has a story that, like mine, is bound up in yesterdays that I don't want to revisit, and stories that have carved hatreds and angers into our lives. That from the word go, we weren't given the love we needed, or if we were and it was way too much, or the realities we faced as children in our public schools, or the things we wanted to do when we graduated that never came to be because life got in the way and messed us up. I don't care. I don't care. I mean, I care, but I don't care when it comes to that big future toward which we are living. When I spoke in Halifax this summer, I talked about a perfect storm, and I may have shared some of it with you before, but a perfect storm is when three things or more come together in a way that sets things just in movement in an unprecedented way. The perfect storm that I spoke about talked about our climate challenges. So many there that to mention just three seems almost ridiculous. But we have a global climate challenge that we are racing towards with blinkers on, some of us entirely blinded. We have social and political challenges that astound and stymie us. And we have church challenges, religious challenges that can take this project toward a future where we are the goodness that the world needs, can take that project completely off track. And I said at the end of that I'm not interested in what church can do unless it is to still that storm. Unless it is to pay attention to all those places where people cannot be happy because we cannot be happy if they are not. If we work towards stilling that storm, as this man who has passed did, then we can create great things. And those things that are in your heart, those sadnesses, those pains, those angers, those hatreds that you carry from before, we can write over top of those because we are here in community and we hold one another with love and with hope and with courage and with challenge. Never without challenge. None of us have hearts that are not scarred. But we have hearts that beat for another future than the one toward which we are frantically racing right now. As this man who stood when he was being sentenced to prison and spoke words about what it was he would see in the world and said, "I am willing to die for this." That is the heart I will for each one of you. That each moment that you live is a moment you are dying for justice and compassion, a moment that you are dying for a world that we can leave our children of which we would be proud, that you are dying for health care, that you are dying for homes, that you are dying for food, that you are dying for a future that we can make come to be. It's in our hands. And I know it is in your hearts. And so as we move on from this great man, his legacy, which is huge, and his legend, which will be, as they are wont to be, bigger even than his legacy, I call you to live that out, to call one another to that greatness, to call your story into being, so that each moment that you live is a moment that you die, and this world becomes a better place for it. Thank you.